Hello, and thanks for joining us for Sustaining Us here on KLCS PBS. I'm David Nazar. Lead contamination can be found all throughout the U.S., everywhere from Flint, Michigan to Southern California. And this is a serious situation. Over the years, while there's been some outrage in some major American cities from both residents and the national news media because of this, Los Angeles and its own lead contamination crisis has been somewhat invisible, although not for the victims, the neighbors of East LA, who for years have been pleading with city, county, and state officials to finally dispose of the lead that has poisoned their backyards. The culprit in all of this, a now closed neighborhood battery recycling plant known as EXIDE.
We have been trying since we found out in 2013 about how we can get this clean, how bad is the problem. We didn't even know how bad things were. And it's taken us years, now over almost a decade, and really things haven't been done the way they should be.
For over 10 years, neighbors like Terry Gonzalez-Cano, living near the EXIDE Technologies battery recycling plant about 5 miles south of downtown Los Angeles, have been battling with government leaders from the city, county, state, even the feds, to once and for all dispose of the massive amounts of lead and arsenic contamination that to this day have polluted their communities and poisoned their homes. For years, Terry and other residents say no one was listening. Many neighbors question whether anyone with the state of California is listening today.
Department of Toxic Substance Control did not want to test the soil. I feel that it was out of community pressure and us threatening to have our soil tested ourselves and go public with the results, forced them to finally test the soil, because they had told us in several public meetings they weren't going to test it because it's not protocol. They normally don't do that. But because of the levels of toxins in the air, it would only make sense that eventually they would fall to the ground, and we were correct. We had no idea how bad it was, but after operating for so long, negligently and criminally, none of the homes here are safe.
EXIDE is located in the city of Vernon, next to East LA and South LA, where there are some of the poorest neighborhoods in California. This disadvantaged community of Los Angeles borders the 15-acre recycling plant. The facility had been operating in this area for over 90 years, recycling anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 lead-acid car batteries and other types of batteries a day. And despite the fact that state of California regulators had this toxic battery plant on their radar for years and knew EXIDE was a primary lead polluter in the region, EXIDE somehow escaped the scrutiny and was still allowed to stay in business. That is until 2015, when in part, the state of California and their Department of Toxic Substances Control, after years of neglect, finally stepped in. DTSC finally began a massive cleanup of the contaminated soil. The lead pollution was so egregious, EXIDE was forced to close permanently. The company signed an agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office to shutter the business. The deal allowed EXIDE and its employees to avoid prosecution for years of what was ruled environmental crimes, crimes that included illegal storage, disposal, and shipment of hazardous waste. The company also agreed to pay about $50 million to help demolish and clean the plant and the surrounding communities. Scientists estimate this colossal project to rid the lead in a nearly 2-mile radius of the plant is still going to take years, costing hundreds of millions of dollars, and they say the environmental impact is overwhelming. The soil, groundwater, and air around the plant all tested high for toxic metals, with estimates of as many as 10,000 homes contaminated from the lead emissions. Lead is a neurotoxin that, when ingested, can cause serious physical and mental health problems. So what did EXIDE do knowing this? Take responsibility, clean the neighborhood, work with neighbors like any conscientious corporation should? No. The shamed battery plant filed for bankruptcy and ran away, leaving neighbors, people of color, mostly low-income Hispanics, to fend for themselves. Over the years, I repeatedly contacted EXIDE for comment. No one ever returned my emails or phone messages. The company is not talking. Terry Gonzalez-Cano is talking, and as she explains, these days her battle with the state of California and DTSC is now a war, with neighbors fighting for their lives. Terry has lived in Boyle Heights near East LA next to EXIDE her entire life. Now she's a neighborhood activist fighting for environmental justice for her community. Terry has dedicated her life this past decade to speak on behalf of thousands of angry neighbors, many of whom are still irate, believing they are invisible and ignored, while their homes and backyards are still drenched in lead.
DTSC has let us down consistently. That's the only thing they've been consistent in, is letting us down. They were negligent in supervising the company. This should never have happened. Different violations, criminal violations, they never notified the public. It was when we pressured them for answers did we finally find out what was happening. They let it happen, and then they're never transparent with us. They don't tell us the truth. They tell us what they want us to hear, because we're constantly getting either misinformation, no information, or just plain, we know you're upset, but this is our decision. Basically, you have to live with it.
Terry believes this lead crisis, in part, is still here today because her neighborhood is not an affluent community of money and means. She says this disadvantaged minority community was simply unable to fight back over the years.
If this was any affluent community, this would have been cleaned up. People from EXIDE would have went to jail. People at the state agencies and the federal agency, EPA, that supervises DTSC, they would have been fired. But here we are, years later, people have lost their lives. That's the worst part of it. People have lost their lives due to their negligence and incompetence, and no one has been fired. No one has went to jail. And they get to do this all over again someplace else to another minority communities. All the communities affected by this EXIDE contamination are all minority communities. We're an environmental justice zone with the worst environmental catastrophe that we've had in this state ever. Some of experts that we've spoken to have said that it's way worse than that of Flint, Michigan. Yet no one even knows that we even have this problem. And they're in no hurry to fix it.
Today, the California Department of Toxic Substances Control says the state is well aware of the problems out here and is working with residents living near EXIDE to dispose of the lead. DTSC says the agency has been routinely sending teams of workers to clear out the lead-impacted soil. This is the largest residential project of its kind in California history. DTSC says they've cleaned hundreds of homes so far, exteriors, and even in some cases, the interiors of houses to clean out things like lead dust or fugitive dust or soil tracked into the home. The California Department of Toxic Substances says workers have taken many samples of soil from over 8,500 parcels to determine the extent of the contamination, and DTSC has put together an interactive map which details the lead contamination and identifies properties prioritized for cleanup. DTSC provided us their own video interviews they took of a few residents who DTSC says are appreciative of the help the state of California has been giving them.
They did their samples, they came back, they said we're going to be doing it in this day. I had another young lady come in and she explained everything to me.
Sí, todo está bien.
Yes, everything is fine. We were all happy. There really weren't any issues. All went well.
State representatives say they are now also working with the neighbors to help them better understand their individual sampling results, as well as the entire cleanup process and work schedule. Some residents are also offered temporary relocation during the soil excavation. Once the lead-contaminated soil is dug out, DTSC restores the landscaping of the respective homes. DTSC officials insist the state of California is committed to making these neighborhoods safe. The question is, are most of the residents in this toxic, polluted neighborhood convinced they are now safe?
Both my parents passed from illnesses and diseases caused by the contaminants in the ground. My brother is end-stage cancer. He's terminal. There's no chance or hope for recovery for him. I've had multiple health problems my whole life, from liver disease, and I live a very healthy lifestyle. My liver shot, I've had strokes, I've had, I have multiple tumors, I have tumors in different parts of my body. I can't ever remember a time where I wasn't sick. And now, being a single parent, I have a son who I might not even live to see graduate because of all of my health issues and concerns. And I have no one to take care of him. I know we're not going to get any help from the state. They've already said that public health isn't their concern or their responsibility. So DTSC has no intention of ever acknowledging or even helping the health affected individuals. We've had 19 people die of cancer or are suffering with cancer on one small city block. And that's not including the people who develop chronic illnesses and chronic problems because of that. All of our children have had medical issues, all of them. It's sad to say that most everybody's gone, so it breaks my heart to see that future generations of other people's families are going to suffer the same thing that my family did, and that's heartbreaking. So I'm sorry for getting emotional, but that's just so incredibly wrong for this to happen to anybody.
Joining me now to discuss this further is Dr. Meredith Williams. Dr. Williams is a director of the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, or DTSC as it's known, part of the California Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Williams is a scientist, and she and her department work towards environmental justice and fair and equitable enforcement of California's environmental laws. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Williams.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
What exactly is the state, specifically your department, DTSC, responsible for?
DTSC has the responsibility for protecting Californians against the impacts and harm from toxic chemicals, past, present, or future. So we clean up contamination that's been left behind by toxic spills or industrial uses. We make sure that any toxic materials that are used now in commerce are used properly, and that when they're just transported around the state or disposed of, that's done properly, and the proper care is taken. And then we have a program we call our Safer Consumer Products Program, and that's a very forward-looking, disruptive program. And it compels manufacturers to look for safer alternatives to toxic chemicals in consumer products. In the case of EXIDE, we're responsible for overseeing the cleanup of this very contaminated site, as well as contamination in the surrounding neighborhoods.
So exactly, Dr. Williams, how did the state of California, DTSC, get involved in this EXIDE lead crisis in the first place?
Well, when the facility was operational, EXIDE used a number of hazardous chemicals, and that meant that they operated under a DTSC permit. Once they ceased operations, DTSC became responsible for overseeing their cleanup of the facility site, and DTSC was given the responsibility to clean up the contamination in the neighborhoods around the site. And so we are responsible for putting taking samples of all the 10,000 properties in a 1.7 mile radius around the factory, and we've tested those samples. We prioritize sites based on the amount of contamination. We oversee the cleanup. We secured contractors, and we do the outreach to the community to make sure they understand the cleanup process and help them get through it.
Do you have any kind of relationship with EXIDE? If any, are you in contact with them? And with that said, have you levied fines or lawsuits against this now shuttered battery recycling plant, Dr. Williams?
Yeah, we have quite a history with EXIDE. As I mentioned earlier, we oversaw their permit. And in 2013 and 2014, we did issue enforcement orders telling them exactly what they had to do to operate the facility safely. They continued to violate those requirements, and ultimately in 2014, we denied them the permit. We did that in partnership with other regulatory agencies. In 2015, EXIDE decided to stop operations completely. And since that time, we've been trying to get them to take responsibility for the cleanup. And I have to say, it's been a frustrating process. And in just one example, they were required to do a full investigation of the amount of contamination in the neighborhoods around the facility. And that investigation was wholly deficient. And as a result, DTSC had to reject that report. And because of these continued problems and the continued noncompliance, we actually went back to the U.S. Attorney and asked it to terminate a non-prosecution agreement that had been put in place for EXIDE and for its directors and officers.
I'm going to defend you a bit, Dr. Williams, and then some criticism with all due respect. Certainly disposing of all this lead, this is no easy task, to say the least. This is a monster task. Yet with that said, you've heard the critics, mostly the very angry neighbors who claim your department should have had this area of East LA, Boyle Heights, Vernon, all the area around the plant taken care of years ago. The LA Times has reported on it for years. Why has this taken so many years for your department? And looking at this objectively, could you, Dr. Williams, have been more proactive?
Well, I appreciate the question, and you're right, it is a monstrous task, and it's worth taking a minute to talk about the scale of the project. It is the biggest residential cleanup the state of California has ever seen. And it's hard even to compare it to other cleanups around the country. So, for instance, there's a very large cleanup that was undertaken in Omaha, Nebraska, and that cleanup took 17 years to clean up 13,000 properties. We're in year 6, and if you look at the first 6 years of the Omaha project, they averaged cleaning up a little less than 9 properties a month. Right now, DTSC, over the first 6 years of this project, has been able to clean up almost 21 properties a month. And then, if you look at where we were toward the end of last year, before the rains and before coronaviruses, we were actually able to clean up 90 properties a month. So, yes, it is taking a long time, but we are satisfied with that rate of cleanup, and it's consistent with the amount of funds we have. That said, it did take us a long time to get up and running. We're in a very different role than we ever have been. Normally, we're overseeing another responsible party who hires the contractors and oversees all the work. In this case, we had to take that on, and we had to be very mindful that we were using taxpayer dollars. And that means we had to dot the I's and cross the T's. And then we took some extra time to make sure that the residents who live around the site and have been impacted have the opportunity to benefit from the jobs that are being created from this cleanup. So we established a project labor agreement that has requirements for hiring local talent, and then we made sure there was a prevailing wage. And I've had a chance to meet with some of those workers. I've met with the Reyes brothers. I met with Blossom Baptist, whose extended family, a number of her family are working on those crews. So yes, it definitely took us a long time to get up and running, but we're pleased with the progress we're making.
You also have to know many of the people living in these disadvantaged neighborhoods surrounding the plant. They say their voices fell silent because they're a minority community, Hispanic community, people of color, no one listened. In fairness to them, I suppose you could argue that if this massive lead contamination, lead poisoning had happened in, let's say, for example, Beverly Hills, Malibu, I don't know, there would have been immediate action taken. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Williams.
Well, I think you're putting your finger on something very important. This community fought very hard to have its voices heard. They called us out on our track record, and most importantly, they got the legislature's attention and got the legislature to appropriate the funds for the cleanup. And so I salute them for that. Environmental injustice is very real. I think we all know it now in this age of the coronavirus. And the roots of that environmental injustice are racial discrimination. DTSC has a number of strategic actions that it's taking to address environmental justice, to try to promote more just practices, whether that's making language access more available for communities so they can participate in our processes, or prioritizing sites that are in environmental justice communities and making sure that those are the sites that get cleaned up first. We recognize this as a very important issue, and we will continue to fight for environmental justice.
Dr. Meredith, in our final 30 seconds, anything we should know about EXIDE that we do not know about or you did not mention in this interview?
Well, I will mention that in May of 2020, EXIDE declared bankruptcy for the third time. And in its proposal, its bankruptcy proposal, it proposes to walk away from its obligations and abandon this site. And that would leave the state on the hook for the cleanup. It would become one of the many thousands of orphan sites around the state that the state is obligated to clean up. And the fact that bankruptcy laws allow companies to walk away from the harm that they caused is unconscionable. It's just wrong. And in fact, we objected to that settlement on September 15th of 2020.
Dr. Meredith Williams with the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, thank you so much for answering tough questions, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much.
We now travel to the northwest part of Washington State, where a group of scientists and volunteers is searching for 6 swans to try and save them from lead poisoning. Producer Ken Christensen, also with public media partner EarthFix, has our story.
Daniel Zimmerman is on a hunt. His target? The largest waterfowl in North America, the trumpeter swan.
Sometimes there might be a cat and mouse game.
Zimmerman always outlasts them.
You're gonna get that swan when it starts to tire out.
But giving up may be their only chance of survival, because these swans are sick with lead poisoning.
And they're dying from it. And so we go over there and try to get taken care of.
Zimmerman is part of a small group of scientists and volunteers in Washington State who are trying to save them. Today, he finds about 10 swans showing symptoms of lead toxicity.
Apparently they're feeding all in the same field or wherever they were.
Every winter, trumpeter swans migrate from Alaska to the Pacific Northwest in search of food, but they end up eating something they shouldn't. Lead hunting ammunition. A single shotgun shell can contain more than 200 toxic lead pellets. Hunters have used them for centuries, and they dot the region's landscape.
It could take from one of those to maybe 10 to kill a swan.
Like other waterfowl, swans eat rocks and pebbles to help them grind up and digest their food. And lead ammunition looks no different. Wildlife officials say this kind of lead poisoning has killed hundreds of swans a year in the Pacific Northwest since the late 1990s. The lead poisoning may kill as many as 20 million animals nationwide each year, according to the Humane Society of the United States. Scientists first noticed the swan die-offs at Judson Lake on the Canadian border. They used bamboo poles to stop the birds from landing on the lake, and death rates dropped 80%. But since then, other toxic hotspots have popped up.
There's a big deposit of lead, and it's just kind of all over, and there's only so much you can do.
One thing he can do is bring the 6 swans here, the Whatcom Wildlife Rehabilitation Center near Mount Baker. In the past 2 years, Alicia Ellsby has had more patients than usual.
We saw a very high jump in swans. Normally it's 13 to 15 that we see. We got in 121 last year.
Ellsby first analyzes the swans' lead levels. A few of them show signs of hope. It will take Ellsby 2 months to remove the lead from their bodies. She feeds them and medicates them twice a day.
It's definitely the best thing when they come in with the lead level that we can treat. It is worth it even for one patient.
But she expects her workload will only increase. In recent years, the trumpeter swan population has been rising in North America, and so has the amount of lead in the environment. Lead ammunition is banned in waterfowl hunting, but legal under other circumstances across the country. Ellsby says other patients like bald eagles and hawks also come in with lead poisoning.
It would be nice to see lead being banned in all cases and not have the chance to get into the environment.
Regardless of a change in laws, wildlife officials expect 6 swans to keep turning up.
Hi, I just got your call about the swan.
And Zimmerman to keep tracking them down.
Thanks, Earthfix and producer Ken Christensen for that report. For more information about our program, just click on klcs.org and then click Contact Us to send us your questions and comments or story ideas so we can hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Sustaining Us here on KLCS PBS. I'm David Nazar.